All right, good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is the Douglas Hills Church of Christ that you're tuned into, and this is our new study that we're beginning tonight. This is going to be our first study on this subject, on the history of the crucifixion, or the crucifixion as a historical event. We can kind of phrase it either way. And we'll go in a little bit tonight about what exactly that's going to mean and what exactly we're going to do over the course of the next 13 weeks here as we examine this subject matter. We're going to start tonight, all of our conversations tonight is going to be an overview of the course material and what we're going to be discussing in general. But open your Bible with me to Luke chapter 23. We're going to start there this evening in Luke 23, and we're going to read almost this entire chapter. Luke 23, of course, is Luke's account of the crucifixion, the occasion with which we will spend the next 13 weeks on Tuesday nights discussing all of the events around it. And just to give you kind of a general idea of what we mean when we say the crucifixion as a historic event, we're going to look at the crucifixion over the course of this time together as if it were any other historic event, the same way we would think about, say, the Civil War or World War II or any other major historic event, to say, what are the factors that lead up to this moment that we're about to read here in Luke chapter 23? Who are the major players? What are the sort of cultural atmospheres that ultimately lead to Jesus dying on the cross? And then, of course, what are the things that contribute to what comes next? We'll spend just a little bit of time on that question, but the majority of our time over the course of this class is going to be to really immerse ourselves into this period and into this world that Luke is about to tell us about as we read here. Join me in Luke chapter 23. We'll start in verse 1. I'm reading for the English Standard Version here. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him. And he had hoped to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with the soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I do not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection, started in the city, and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people, and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to this place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots and divided his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. There's also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I will say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And now about the 6th hour there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. When the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, Certainly this man was innocent. And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breast. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things. That's Luke's account of the crucifixion, which we know the crucifixion is covered in all 4 of the Gospels, of course. One doesn't have to be spiritual, even, to acknowledge that this account that we just read, this event that Luke chronicles here, is the most important moment in the history of human civilization, period. That's an indisputable point. This is a statement that, regardless of one's religious affiliation, one must acknowledge that this instance, this moment described here by Luke, is the single most significant event in human history. Never before or since the crucifixion of Jesus has a single event so changed the trajectory of the world. It is an event that is both universal and uniquely personal. It is seemingly insignificant in this moment, and yet life-altering for everyone who has ever lived. It is the moment that all of history leads to and that all time since is measured against. But why? Why is that the case? Why does a homeless Jewish preacher end up being executed by the most powerful nation on earth? How does an outsider with a relatively small group of followers so frustrate the Jewish leadership that they have to plot to kill him? Why did he draw followers in multitudes in the first place? What were the people who were there in the crowd whenever he preached or whenever he did miracles yearning for? What were they seeking? What did he provide them that they didn't have before? On one hand, we can look at this and say that it is nothing that the Romans executed a prisoner. That is absolutely the case. It was nothing for the Romans to execute a prisoner. It's not like this process that we have today, riddled with appeals and standards of evidence and exclusions to only the most egregious crimes and only in certain locations. Execution was a central tool of Roman governance, especially as it related to their interactions with the Jews. It was a tool of diplomacy in some ways. It was an act of supremacy in every way. It was an accepted part of life under Jewish rule if you were part of the oppressed group. It was so commonplace that even on the day that Jesus was killed, this event, the single most important execution in the history of human civilization, he wasn't even the only one that the Romans killed that day. He was placed in between 2 otherwise forgettable prisoners whose actions in no way raised to our knowledge, if it not for their circumstantial timing. So, if that's the case, if it is quite commonplace, in fact, for the Romans to execute a prisoner, Why was this night different? It wasn't because he's the first person who ever claims he was the Messiah. Far from it. It wasn't because he was the first person to draw the ire of the Jewish leadership. Far from it. He wasn't the first person to gain a following. So why? Why this man? There are only two possible explanations for this, really. It is either the most remarkable happenstance or it's the will of God. It's one of the two. The skeptic must wrestle with the impossibility of happenstance, while we, the believer, acknowledge that this is the will of God, and this is proof of God's will. Over the course of the next 12 weeks, we're going to aim to address the question of why by studying the what, when, where, and how. Let me now provide an overview of what this class will look at and hope to accomplish. I think you're going to enjoy this class. I think that we're going to talk about a lot of things and look at a lot of things that we don't often talk about. We don't talk about every day. Even though we come together once a week around the table to remember the crucifixion, there are still some of these details of history that sort of get lost on us or that are overlooked by us that we don't think about quite as often. And over the course of these 12 weeks, we're going to try to elevate those things and really put ourselves in those positions. I want to say this is neither an evidences course or a critical history course. We're going to operate under the baseline belief with this material that Jesus is the Son of God and that his death was not merely just another execution done by the Romans that happened to become the most important event in history. We're going to operate under the belief, the stated belief, that Jesus is the Son of God and that his death is what the Bible says it was. We believe that this is the most important event in history by design, not by happenstance. And that's a really important distinction for us. There is plenty of critical scholarship that exists about this moment, the events of that night, what it all meant, how it happened, etc. We're not going to really delve into that at all over the course of our time talking about this. We're going to use this as an opportunity to understand this as it's meant to be understood, which is a moment that defines not only history, but that defines us as individuals. Okay, let me say a couple of things too about something that we won't do or something that we aren't going to do. There is no question historically that Jesus Christ was a person and that he was crucified. There's no question about it. We can say that more definitively than we can say why Abraham Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president, or whether or not John Wilkes Booth actually said "Sic semper tyrannis" whenever he jumped from the balcony. Okay, I mean, it is such an indisputable historic fact that we will not even begin to entertain the alternative, and neither should you. In any instance, it is an indisputable fact that Jesus Christ existed and that he was crucified. I'll just provide two points of evidence related to that, and we will not deal with that question again at all for the remainder of our time in this class. The first comes from Josephus. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he is one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, and when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored for life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Even this quote has some dispute. I maybe should slow down a little so Laura can catch up, but even this quote has some dispute about whether or not this is exactly what Josephus said, but regardless of any of that critical scholarship, it's unquestionable that Josephus acknowledged Jesus lived and that he was crucified. Tacitus, Roman historian. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So, once again, Tacitus here acknowledging Jesus Christ existed. He was put to death by Pontius Pilate. This is a Roman historian, has absolutely no reason to stretch the truth or to change history whatsoever. It is a historic fact. We will not deal with this again, and we will treat it as historic fact from this point forward. So, what is our purpose in this course, or in this class, this time that we'll spend together? Our purpose is to help Christians understand the cultural, political, and religious factors that preceded and led to the crucifixion of Jesus, providing a knowledge of the first century world as early followers would have experienced it, allowing the modern reader to more deeply understand the Scriptures and its important timing, and the important timing of the crucifixion. So, again, to reinforce exactly what we're going to aim to do over the course of this time, one of the things that we're going to really focus on in our time together is to hopefully remove our sort of modern view. And by that I mean, I want us to really think about this event as if we were first century observers, and to have the level of knowledge and understanding of life in the first century to be able to sort of put ourselves in the position of first century observers, to be able to gain enough understanding and a deep enough understanding of exactly what factors existed leading up to this moment that allowed this moment to happen, and how it would have been as impactful as it was. This is a really important historic question, but it's important for us to place ourselves in this position. To do so, we're going to use the Bible. This is a Bible class. We're going to use the Bible, and we're going to treat the Bible as a source document. Absolutely, no question. We're going to treat it as a source document. And we're going to treat outside material only in an effort to understand the cultural, political, and religious factors that are dominating the world around Jesus at the time. Now, I also want to say that whenever we talk about some of the cultural, political, and religious factors, it's not going to be my aim to give you such a thorough understanding of Hellenism, or such a thorough understanding of life in the Second Temple, or such a thorough understanding of Herod the Great, that you are able to really think about these things in a scholastic manner yourself, or that it's such a deep dive into these things that we deal with factors that don't contribute to Jesus or to the crucifixion. In each one of these examples, we're going to look at these things through the lens of the crucifixion and how they build up to the crucifixion, and the puzzle pieces that come together that lead to the crucifixion and make the crucifixion possible. That's really going to be our goal. There are going to be three sort of main sections that we're going to break this material into, if you will. The first I call Mindset of a Conquered People. And this will cover, as you can see on the screen behind me here, the Second Temple, the Greeks, the Romans, Herod the Great, the mindset of the Jews. What did it mean to be a Jew, a nation bound by religion? How did it handle outside influence, the Maccabees, the Zealots, narratives of the Messiah, the significance of the temple, Messianic narratives twice, the kingdom of God? For us to even begin to take this historic dive, our first step is to understand exactly how the Jews viewed themselves, and how a first century Jew in 30 AD viewed themselves and the world around them. And a major contributor to that, if not the central contributor to that, is the fact that we're dealing with a conquered people. We're dealing with a people whose nation is under the control of another group, an outside force. And we're dealing with a group of people who have largely been conquered for centuries. There are very few periods of self-rule, if we could call it that, or an independent nation state as we would think of it today, for the Jews leading up to the time of Jesus' life. There are a few periods which shape some of the mindset whenever Jesus begins his ministry, no doubt, and have a major impact on the way that the Jews see themselves and see him, see his teachings, see the teachings of others at the time, how the political divisions occur. But for the most part, we're dealing with a group of people who are extremely prideful about who they are and their position as God's chosen people, and they remain extremely prideful, whether or not they're following the law properly or whether or not they're have the leadership that is committed to the law the way they should is a completely different question. But no doubt we're dealing with a prideful people, but a conquered people, a people who have for centuries lived under the fact and the question that emerges from the fact that someone else is actually who calls the shots. It's an extremely important factor that creates this tension that's going to exist not only during Jesus' ministry, but leading up to the Passover and the events that surrounded his eventual death. Now, part of that mindset of a conquered people is the second thing that we'll discuss, which is the two-tiered system, which is how the Romans approached governing a location like Israel at the time, or like Jerusalem. Now, we also must note, this region, even though we sometimes call it, this is not yet called Palestine. It's not until after 70 A.D., actually several decades later, that we get the name Palestine. But regardless, this region and how the Romans approach to governing a region like this is extremely important to the factors that ultimately lead to Jesus' death. There's a lot of what I call have a little, want more individuals who are part of the two-tiered system. This constant tension that the leadership has to deal with of being a group that has a little bit of power and wanting more, but not wanting to jeopardize the power that they have. You can see that theme over and over in the interactions that Jesus has with the Pharisees or other leaders. You can see it over and over again in other aspects of the literature that we'll discuss. But the two-tiered system, and even in Luke's text that we discussed and looked at, looking at the Jews' necessity to push the decision of crucifixion off onto other leaders, and Pilate pushing back on them, not in Luke's text, but in other places, to say, you have your own laws, judge them based on your own laws. This two-tiered system plays a huge role, ultimately, in Jesus' death, and in the way that Jesus' teaching ultimately offends them. One of the things that we'll see as we go through the material is there are a bunch of different groups. There's no singular Judaism in the time of Jesus' life. One cannot say that there's a singular Judaism in the same way that we today cannot say that there's a singular Christianity. We know, of course, that there are multiple divisions and multiple denominations within Christianity. The same thing is true within Judaism at the time of Jesus. He doesn't fit within any of those sects, and he manages to offend all of them in some way, basically. That's an incredibly important factor, combined with this two-tier system and combined with the tension that it creates, that ultimately leads to his crucifixion. All of which we'll see as we reach the end of the class and read this passage from Luke again, or other passages that talk about his crucifixion, all of which we'll see the way in which the arguments are being made. And you probably already see them as you think about it, the arguments that are being made to Pilate or in Pilate back to the Jewish leaders, etc., that come back to this. And then, of course, our third main section is the crucifixion itself, really looking at all of these events that surround the trial and surround the moment itself. Look at this is what I call our lecture schedule. My goal over the course of this class is going to be to lecture for about 30 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes on Tuesday nights, and on these topics here laid out. I'll go over some of these. Some of them we might, some weeks we might go a little bit over, and you can always watch on YouTube after the fact to catch up if you miss one. But the goal is going to be to break this material into 13 different lectures that all lead up to this final section, in which we will just basically follow the text, if you will, at the close of the last few weeks of the class. And I think that as we do that, reading it a second time, you'll see the way so many of these factors play into the chanting of the crowd, or the conversation that Pilate goes through, the decision that Pilate goes through, all of these things that go from the garden on. So next week we're going to start this process with a lecture called A Conquered People, or that I've titled A Conquered People. This idea that we already discussed, that is so essential to understanding how a Jew in the first century viewed himself, and to the tension in the world that Jesus is constantly interacting with. We're going to look at the Second Temple period, and again, with a focus not of understanding the Second Temple period as a whole, but understanding how it is that these factors ultimately contribute to Jesus' crucifixion. The second, one humanity. One of the things that I look forward to that lecture, to that week a lot. I think often we understand the Jewish perspective, and by that I mean sort of the cultural influence that exists because of Judaism at the time, and don't realize the remarkably large role that Greek culture and that Hellenism is playing in not just the world at the time of Jesus' ministry or the time of his crucifixion, but the time that came before, how it contributes to a lot of the various sects within Judaism, and how critically important the interaction between Christianity and Hellenism is for the centuries that follow Jesus' death. The week after that, we'll look at the Roman Empire, and we'll look particularly at Herod, and how Herod sort of combines a lot of these factors. Herod, who is not alive, Herod the Great, who is not alive at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He had been dead for more than 25 years at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, but who is really in many ways a figure that is uniting in all of these various factors and is so essential to the world in which Jesus is going to be born into and live. We know his essential nature in the world that Jesus is born into because we know that he literally tries to kill him. But even beyond that, so much of the Jewish world and so much of the interaction between the Jewish world and the Roman Empire is governed by the leadership of Herod, or the decisions that were made during Herod's time. And it's really important to understand that for Rome, this is not a significant civilization in the grand scheme of their empire. Whenever we talk about Pontius Pilate in week 10, one of the things that we'll talk about is that this is not necessarily a great job to be given, that Pilate is given. This is a little bit like being ambassador to Latvia. It's nice. It's nice to be an ambassador, but don't confuse it with being the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. Really, the importance of this region for the Roman Empire is that it lays in between Syria and Egypt. It is a crossroads in between two much more important empires. And that's not only going to shape the way that Jews view themselves and the way the Jewish world views itself, but it's especially going to shape the way that Rome operates within Jerusalem, within Israel at the time. It's one of the factors that's going to contribute to Rome having a very short leash with the Jewish people, because this is not a civilization that Rome has any interest in bargaining with. It is a civilization that Rome has interest in controlling, and controlling in such a way that it is not problematic at every stage. Now, that already can help you understand a little bit about that tension that I'm talking about that ultimately leads to Jesus' death. So, week 5, Zealots and Revolutionaries, the Jewish dream of self-rule. Building right on top of what I just said about the way that Rome approached the region, you can understand why it is that there are so many different movements and sects that really, of course, the pinnacle of which being the Maccabean Revolt in 164 BC, but you can understand why there are so many sects and so many groups who their task and their hope is to reestablish Jewish self-rule, and the way in which that contributes to the culture. Week 6, Messianic messengers, already mentioned at the outset that Jesus isn't the first person, and not the only person who ever claimed to be the Messiah. There are a lot of Messianic hope that begins really under Persian occupation or under Persian rule. You see a significant rise in Messianic hope, and that stretches all the way until the time of Jesus' life and plays a major role in how his ministry will ultimately go, how the Jewish leadership interacts with him, how the public interacts with him, all of those things. The two-tier system, we're going to talk about the Pharisees, the Sadducees. What makes them different? Sometimes we kind of gloss over them or lump them in together. They are not monolithic. They are sects that are different, that have different interests, different approaches to Hellenism, different approaches to Roman rule, different approaches to the Jewish text. Not so much a different approach to Jesus, ultimately, but certainly different ways in which they view the ultimate trajectory of Jerusalem and of Israel at the time. And then we will move into, for the final 6 weeks, like I said, following the text and using those conversations from before to help us better understand the text. You've heard the room where it happened. We've titled this The Garden Where It Happened. The plot, the triumphant entry, the garden, and then that second week, the Passover. These two things will merge together. I want us in those 2 weeks to really get a view of what Jerusalem is like in totality at the time of the Passover. Jerusalem at the time of the Passover is so much different than Jerusalem on an average Wednesday because of the extraordinary number of people and the increase in people who travel to Jerusalem specifically for the purpose of the Passover, but also so many different factors and influence that contribute to the atmosphere of the time. And you can see the way that this plays out. The triumphant entry, you have to wonder whenever you read the triumphant entry versus the crowd who is yelling for him to be crucified and asking for Barabbas to be released. How is this the same city? How is this the same group of people? So in those 2 weeks, we'll kind of immerse ourselves into exactly what things are like during this actual week and this weekend leading up to the Passover feast. Week 10, the whole time we're going to talk about Pontius Pilate. And that will be our most sort of historically focused lecture. We'll talk about how we know that he's real. You can find a critical historian for everything in the Bible, absolutely everything. And there dared to be critical historians at one point about whether or not Pontius Pilate truly exists, whether or not he was ever the Roman prefect, whether or not he actually put Jesus to death. There's remarkable historic evidence for Pontius Pilate, and he is a very interesting and conflicted figure. I think that by delving into who he is, we begin to the little that we can, understand all of the tension that's going on in his mind on the night of the crucifixion of Jesus. A man who clearly wanted to release Jesus, who clearly believed that he was innocent, who had the power to release him, but for some reason was too weak to do so. For some reason caved to the crowd, despite the fact that the Roman government was remarkably brutal. He had soldiers at his beck and call. He could have easily made the decision to release him. He could have easily done what he said he wanted to do, which was to scourge him and let him go. But instead, he gives in to the mob and washes his hands of the entire thing. I think that we'll see a little bit more of maybe how this figure ended up in this position through that. The trial to end all history, we'll go through that. Week 12, the brutality of the crucifixion. I want to warn you ahead of time when we talk about that issue, when we talk about that week, we're going to talk about it in the grotesque, ugly, brutal manner in which crucifixion actually is. So often depictions of crucifixion in art or of Jesus on the cross in art, he looks almost calm and peaceful. And there is almost something endearing and sympathetic when we see images of Jesus on the cross. I want to tell you, there's nothing endearing and sympathetic about crucifixion. It is brutal, it is ugly, it is one of the worst ways to die that man has ever come up with. And we will talk about it in the grotesque manner in which it deserves to be talked about. That will be an uncomfortable conversation, an uncomfortable lecture, I promise you. I warn you ahead of time. And then we'll close with the question that in some ways we begin with. Why this? There are many people who claim to be the Messiah. There are many people who were executed by Rome. So why is it that the movement didn't die when they killed this guy? A very important question that the believer and the skeptic has to wrestle with. The themes that we'll look at, we already mentioned some: foreign influence and occupation, so incredibly important. Power struggle among the elites. Like I said, the elites are not monolithic. There is no single Judaism. And there is an endless power struggle going on between various sects of elites that plays a huge contributing role into the ultimate decision to kill Jesus. Weak leadership, which means the weak leadership of the Jews and the weak leadership of Pilate, the weak leadership of the Romans. This whole region, this whole period is in many ways a problem of weak leadership throughout. One could probably argue that that's why the Jews were able to retake Jerusalem in the way they were in 66 AD, is relative weak leadership, and it's why Rome had to so brutally destroy Jerusalem in 70, is decades, probably, you could argue, of weak leadership all around. Spiritual and intellectual dogmatism. This is going to be so important for us to understand. Jesus is born into a world where that is spiritually and intellectually void of progress. That the great progress among Jewish intellectualism and among Greek intellectualism is dead, really, at the time of Jesus' birth. And it provides this opening, if you will, for a figure like Jesus, only equipped the way Jesus, the Son of God, would be equipped, to inject into the narrative a different way of teaching and a different way of thinking about God. It's a remarkable thing. The outsider, Jesus is the ultimate outsider, and we will see that. Jesus' willingness to die, that goes back to the weak leadership. I think that by the end, and I think that this is evident already, and we know this as Christians, we believe this, but it becomes increasingly evident over and over and over as we think about the crucifixion and think about the text. Jesus was crucified because he chose and was willing to die. I think that one could argue quite convincingly that if he had chosen to try to convince Pilate not to crucify him, that we sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels. I doubt it even would have required that much. Pilate is a man who is eager to let him go, and Jesus probably could have easily convinced him to let him go. The only reason, as is stated by him, that Pilate is able to ultimately make that decision is because the power comes from God and Jesus is willing to die. The effects of timing, look, God could have chosen any period of human history, could have chosen any way throughout human history to bring the Messiah, to bring his Son to earth, and had just as much impact and had been just as effective at spreading the gospel and ensuring that his teaching reached every corner of the world. But you will see, I think, over the course of our conversations over the next 3 months, that it makes sense why this timing worked so well. That there are so many factors that create that puzzle that I mentioned of what ends up becoming the largest social movement in human history. Let's just look real quick here at the map as it existed at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. This is a map of all of Europe and Asia and parts of North Africa. Of course, our concern is not almost entirely with that section in orange on the left that says Roman Empire. You can see that Rome at the time of Jesus' crucifixion controls the entire Mediterranean. It is a remarkably strong nations still. And you can see all of the land in which they control north and south of Israel and of Jerusalem. And as I mentioned, you can tell just by looking and thinking about the land mass that they controlled how relatively insignificant for the Roman Empire in the grand scheme this little swath of land is. Contributes to their brutality, contributes to Pilate being the guy who gets sent, contributes to the very short leash. If anything, again, if a skeptic were going to analyze this in a critical way, one has to wonder how on earth did someone from this relatively insignificant part of the Roman Empire create a religion or have teachings that penetrated the empire as such to be adopted as the state religion. One would never anticipate that out from what became Palestine would come the state religion of the most powerful empire in the history of existence at the time. There are many other places which were far more cosmopolitan, far more learned, and probably one could definitely argue had religious traditions that were more similar to the average Roman religious tradition at the time. Another remarkable question of history, not one that we'll deal with over the next 13 weeks, but one that helps reinforce our own belief, I think. This is Israel at the time of Jesus. It says first century there. You can see, of course, Jerusalem, which is the centerpiece of the faith virtually always, but it's especially the centerpiece of the faith once again during the Second Temple period. It's where the temple is. The temple, unlike a lot of other religious traditions, even at the time, unlike a lot of the other world's religions at the time, Judaism is unique in that the temple is the centerpiece of the faith. That's incredibly important whenever we think about the Passover and we think about Jesus teaching in Jerusalem and the interactions that Jesus has in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an incredibly important place for the average Jew and for Jewish leaders. You can see here Caesarea up in Samaria, which was the Roman capital, was a city that Rome built, hence the name, Caesar being in the name. That is where Pilate would normally be stationed. He would only come to Jerusalem for the feast and for special occasions. And so the week that Jesus was killed, or the night that he was tried and the day that he was killed, it was not common necessarily that Herod and Pilate would even both be in town. If it was the average weekend, and it wasn't the Passover or one of the feasts, he would have been in Caesarea. Caesarea was, as I said, a city that was built by the Romans and built in a way as to, it's set right on the Mediterranean. You can see its proximity and its importance for the Roman leaders. It was built as a way to sort of entertain foreign dignitaries. They would host foreign dignitaries there, all of those things. Jerusalem is not the headquarters for Rome. It is important for the Jews, understanding with cars and planes and trains and all of these things. Galilee and Nazareth does not seem that far away. Samaria was a world away from Jerusalem in so many ways. There are aspects of the Jewish faith and of Judaism at the time of Jesus' ministry that are so dissimilar from the existing dogma in Jerusalem because it's further away, because they were influenced by Hellenism differently, because it's closer to Caesarea, all of these things. Well, Galilee is even further away than that. And I already mentioned that the role of the outsider is going to be extremely significant in the ultimate crucifixion of Jesus and his interaction with the Jewish leaders and their the just disdain that they eventually grow for him universally. But you can just see from there exactly how far away Jesus is from. So, that, as I mentioned at the outset, is an overview. It provides the basics, the baseline of what you can expect. This is a class that I have put together over the last several weeks. Thought about doing a class like this for a long time. Very excited for the opportunity to be able to do it, and hope that over the course of these 12 weeks that follow this week, that we're going through a process here that not just gives us a deeper understanding of the region, not just gives us a deeper understanding of the religious factors that contribute to who Jesus was and to his teachings and to his crucifixions and to his death and what makes the faith spread the way that it does afterwards, but in particular that it, for us, is encouraging and faith-inducing. I think that it is impossible to look at all of these things that come together the way they do at the crucifixion of Jesus and to walk away thinking that he's anything other than the Son of God and thinking anything other than that he died for the sins of all humanity. Whenever we go in with the mindset of analyzing this the way that we will, I think that all of us will walk away with a stronger faith and a deeper understanding because of it. And that is ultimately our hope. Next week, we will begin with the first sort of topical examination, and that topical examination will be about Second Temple Judaism and exactly what it is about the Second Temple period that shapes the Jewish identity, all focusing on how those factors eventually lead up to Jesus' crucifixion. That will be next Tuesday at 7:30. Look forward to it.